Good morning, Christina. Welcome back. Here we are for our fifth and final session of office hours. So what have the students been asking about for today?
Great. So as usual, our first questions are conceptual. And the first one being whether you can please review the concept of trade adjustment assistance.
Sure. The idea of trade adjustment assistance was a policy first advanced in the Kennedy administration as part of the Trade Act of 1962, I believe, 60, yeah. And it was, the idea was to get union support for reducing barriers to trade, free trade, and in return, the government was going to fund a policy by which people who lost their jobs due to what we today call outsourcing, going offshore, would receive extended unemployment assistance from the federal government. In the US, most unemployment assistance comes from state governments, and relocation and retraining expenses. And it was a policy that did indeed work politically in getting the union movement, AFL-CIO, to support the Trade Act and the tariff reductions, but it was still born because the Johnson administration, after President Kennedy's assassination, had other priorities and didn't really implement it. And as a result, by the end of the 1960s, no actual benefits had been paid out. And it was something of a tragic history because by the early 1970s, business started to see it as a good policy. But by then, the unions had bailed out. And so even though in countries like Denmark, it's extremely well developed and works pretty well. The best book on this is by a man called Alden. The name of the book, I think, is called Failure to Adjust. It recounts this tragic history in the United States. What we propose in our book, The Wolf at the Door, that'll be out next year, and that I talked about in the lecture, was a much more extensive version of this that we call universal adjustment assistance. And this is partly because among the obstacles to trade adjustment assistance was the fact that it seemed arbitrary to help people who lost their jobs to trade versus people who lost their jobs for other reasons. And that's one of the reasons that first the unions gave for backing away from it. And then in the Reagan administration, Ronald Reagan made exactly the same argument for basically underfunding the program to the point of its virtual extinction. So it was bad politics in that sense. It created blocking coalitions. But it's also bad policy because increasingly, as we've discussed, jobs are going to technology rather than to trade. And from the point of view of the person who loses the job, really immaterial if it's going to a robot or it's going to China, or increasingly it's going to go to a robot in China maybe. And so really what's needed is a program of what we call universal adjustment assistance that will provide this sort of retraining regardless of why people lose their jobs.
Thank you. And the second question students had was whether you could review again Volcker's Rule and its significance.
Sure. So the Volcker Rule was designed to prevent investment banks from trading on their own accounts. And so the idea here is that had actually been in as part of Glass-Steagall, enacted way back in the Roosevelt years, that if investment banks are trading for themselves to make their own profits, this creates a dangerous conflict of interest because they are also custodians of their clients' interests. And so you get the difficulty that, as it turned out to be the case with Goldman, that when they figured out that subprime mortgages were going to be going south, they were accused, and pretty convincingly accused, of unloading them onto their unsuspecting clients. So that's the reason for prohibiting investment banks from investing on their own accounts. The cost is that investment banks are supposed to facilitate transactions, and so there's a practice called market making, whereby if you have a client that wants to sell some shares, let's say, and there's no buyer, the bank will buy the shares and find a buyer. So in that case, they're just trying to facilitate a transaction. And investment banks do that all of the time. And so the difficulty is, how do you prevent the former without also killing off market making? And that was the tussle over the Volcker Rule as part of the Dodd-Frank law.
Great. The next question is on UBI and whether there are electorates of some democracies that are more welfarist or less averse to this idea of UBA or UBA-like initiatives.
So I think that's not empirically right. So if you look at the countries where funds have been created that are universally distributed to everybody, or in the case of Alaska, the states, these tend not to be welfarist arguments, but rather kind of windfall profits tax or windfall profit redistribution of a windfall profit. So when the Norwegians discovered North Sea oil, the notion was to create a sovereign wealth fund that would benefit everybody. And the Alaska example that was discussed in the lectures is also kind of windfall benefit that they didn't want to be put to other uses. That's different from a welfarist argument, which is the sort of argument Van Parijs makes and people on the left have made for universal basic income. And when you see that idea put to voters in referendums, for example, in Switzerland, it was heavily defeated. So even in Europe, it's also garners opposition from organized labor because it would reduce their leverage. So I don't think it's ever been an electoral winner as a welfarist idea.
Okay, thank you. So the next few questions, we received a couple, are on political sources of populism. And the first one is, students are wondering whether you could explain, again, causes for the decline of unions since the 1970s and how that has contributed to a shift of voters' concerns from inequality to insecurity.
So the decline of unions is principally due to two things. I think the first is globalization and the decline of manufacturing jobs in the older capitalist democracies. And a big part of the reason for this is the differential price of labor, what you in your own lecture referred to as the flying geese theory. So as manufacturing jobs went to Mexico or Thailand or China or Indonesia, because the wages were much lower, the old capitalist countries became increasingly service economies. And service economies are much more difficult to organize, partly because the jobs in those sectors can also be offshored very easily, except for things like restaurants where you actually physically have to go there. But things like telephone assistance or, calling Quicken Loans to get a mortgage, the person you speak to could be in Mumbai. They don't have to be in the United States. So as we've had globalization reducing the leverage, another way of thinking about it is through Hirschman's lens, that you have very different exit costs. So labor has high exit costs because you've got to pack up and move your family and go somewhere else and restart and retrain and all the things we've been discussing. Whereas it's very easy for capital to move, very, very low exit costs for capital. And so this is basically explains the decline of the unionized sectors, across the developed world. And I think that the way unions have responded, my sort of bumper sticker was that they end up protecting shrinking labor aristocracies less well. So they're shrinking because the jobs are disappearing, and they're protecting them less well because they have less leverage. And the second big reason, I think, for the decline of the political power of unions is where we started right at the beginning of the course with the collapse of communism. Taking an alternative to capitalism off the table has increased the bargaining power of capital greatly, because there's really much less fear that the workers will ever reach the point where they believe they have nothing to lose but their chains.
Right. Yeah, you just talked on it. You just touched on it. How business interests have become so strong relative to labor. Is there anything else you would like to add?
Well, I think that that's what I just mentioned is the principal source. Another example of it, it's more of a symptom of it than a cause, is if you look at the changing curriculum in business schools. They've gone away from talking about being public spirited and doing public good and just talking about maximizing shareholder wealth as really the only important thing for managers to do. There's some little bit of backlash against that, started after 2016 as businesses become more nervous about the rise of populist agendas and maybe concluding they do have some things to be concerned about. But largely it's the Hirschman story. I think that business has so much more industrial leverage because of its capacity to move around the world at the click of a mouse, that labor is just back on their heels and less able to protect the people who are in the unionized sector. And then, of course, as more and more workers are not in the unionized sector, there's something of a conflict of interest between the unionized workers and the non-unionized sector. And we see this all over the world with plants moving, like auto plants moving from Michigan to so-called right-to-work states like in the American South, Florida, or wherever it might be, or in South Africa, where we have high wages in the unionized sector, but also extremely high levels of unemployment. So you get divisions among workers. It's divided dollar story all over again, playing itself out.
Right. Yeah. So let's talk a bit about weak versus strong parties. And a student was wondering, with political parties becoming weak over time and the democratization of the internet, do you think that there's a danger of cult-like personalities overtaking parties as a center of gravity for voters in the future?
Well, certainly weak parties, as we've defined weak parties, are more susceptible to being overtaken by populist figures. For example, if you have closed list PR, as they have in South Africa, for example, that makes it very difficult for populist figures to take over, because the list is the list. You vote for the party, not the individual, and so on. Whereas if you have open list PR, then celebrities, open list PR allows people not only to vote for the party, but perhaps to reorder the list or to vote for individuals on the list. Then you will tend to get celebrities running and people making populist promises running. Or in the US system, we've seen with the growing importance of primaries since the McGovern-Fraser reforms of the early 1970s, it's absolutely the case that a populist figure with a strong personality can quickly become dominant. This was the Donald Trump story of 2015 and 2016. I should add another way in which parties are weakened. We talked about this with respect to the Labour Party in the UK, but it's gone on in many countries, is the direct election of party leaders by activists who are members of parties, and even in South Africa. But for that feature of the South African system, I think the ANC would have been able to resist Jacob Zuma's hostile takeover, because he also ran as a populist figure with a strong personality. So direct election of leaders or primaries or open list PR, these are all mechanisms of weakening parties that make it more likely that populists will come to power.
Right. So a student was wondering, it seems a little bit counterintuitive that political parties would ever choose to undertake reforms that weaken their own influence. So could you explain that mechanism here again?
It does seem counterintuitive, and I think that you know, there's a particular story to be told in every setting. So in the US, for example, the big push came after the debacle of the Chicago Convention of 1968, when Hubert Humphrey ran as the preferred candidate after the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, and had not run in a single primary, and was associated with the very unpopular war in Vietnam, and that this then produced a fight in the party for reform, and it was a bottom-up fight. And that does tend to be part of the problem, that people are, political reform is always fighting the last war. So then we got strengthened primaries. Then what happened after that was you got people like McGovern picked, and you got a primary challenge by Edward Kennedy against Jimmy Carter, that many people thought damaged him so badly in 1980 that he lost to Ronald Reagan. So then you have a reaction against that. Then we got superdelegates, and the idea of the superdelegates was to counteract the influence of primaries. But then the superdelegates started to be attacked as undemocratic, going back to smoke-filled rooms and so forth. And so we saw the disempowering of superdelegates. This went on in both parties. So in the Republican Party, the superdelegates couldn't stop Trump because they're bound by the outcome of the primaries, at least on the first ballot. And we never go to second ballots. We haven't for decades. And as I may have mentioned, part of the Sanders quid pro quo for supporting Hillary Clinton's candidacy in 2016 was that the superdelegates would be gotten rid of in the future, would be bound on the first ballot in the future. So there's a lot of fighting the last battle, and you can tell particular stories like that. I think the move to direct election of leaders, which we discussed at some length in the lectures, again, this is seen as an antidote to elitist parties and top-down politics, but people misperceive that the cure can be worse than the disease. And that's, so if you look at what's fighting itself out now in the UK, you've got leaders of both parties who I think have lower levels of popularity than any leader of either party in history, fighting it out, and one of them is going to end up as prime minister unless there's a hung parliament. Even then, it's likely that one of them will wind up as prime minister, because both parties have greatly weakened themselves by going to these direct election of leaders. It's a little bit attenuated in the Tory system, but still it goes to the activists. And since the Parliamentary Conservative Party knows it's going to the activists, they have to nominate at least one candidate that's going to be acceptable to the activists. I would say one more thing, that it's very difficult to undo, because it seems to be anti-democratic to take away this kind of authority from party members. People talk about power to the people, but they never ask the question, which people? And so that it's a very difficult problem, to which I'll propose one partial solution in the U.S. case in the final lecture.
We look forward to it. We also talked about two-party systems versus multi-party systems. And you said that two-party systems are more like last best offer arbitration with the voter as the arbitrator, versus in MPS, there's a tendency to create a surplus to give away in negotiations. And could you talk a little bit what that surplus is? Is this about a surplus of issues? And how does this work?
So two-party competition is more like last best offer arbitration because both parties knowing that the voter has to pick one, just as the last best offer arbitrator has to pick one side, they have strong incentives not to take extreme positions, lest the median voter or the arbitrator, in whichever setting you're talking about, is then tempted to go to the other side. So you'll tend to see them converge and tend to not see them making strategic misrepresentations of their views. Multi-party systems are more like regular arbitration in that if you know there's going to be a negotiation later, you want to be able to say, I've been reasonable, I've given up something, and so you should as well. Just as a store puts up its prices so that it can later on say it's having a sale. And so in multi-party systems, the incentive is to create, I call it a surplus, something that you can give away later that's not really that important to your core supporters. And what that surplus will be will vary given the nature of the party. If it's an identity-based party, maybe they'll say they want all driving to be stopped in all of Jerusalem for all of the Sabbath, when they'll then retreat to a position like only in the religious Jewish areas or some such thing. So that's the sense in which they'll create, even if it's not money as a in divisible goods sense. They'll have an incentive to find stuff to appear to give away, to appear to have accommodated the other side. Yeah. So that's the difference.
Thank you. We talked a bit about American and British populism and the differences and similarities there, but could you elaborate on that?
Well, the big issue that has made populism feasible in the American system is the presidentialism and the primaries. The British have neither. So the British system is less vulnerable in that sense, and there was some brief experimentation with what they called primaries in the Conservative Party in 2016. They were actually more like American caucuses. And the motivation was to try and, interestingly, increase turnout and to try and get better representation of women and minorities. And they had neither effect, and they only did it in a few constituencies. They had neither of those effects, and I think they were sufficiently traumatized. The Tory establishment was sufficiently traumatized by watching what was happening on the other side of the Atlantic that they backed out of it. And I think that the other advantage the British have is that because they don't have a written constitution, some of the stuff that they blundered into might be easier to blunder out of. As I said, it's very hard to get rid of direct election of leaders once you have it because it seems anti-democratic. But even that, I think, might be significantly curtailed. So if, for example, if the Labour Party were to take a massive shellacking on December 12th, not predicting that it will, but if it were to happen, I think then there would be a lot of pressure to change this leadership selection rule that they now have. I also think that it'll be a cold day in hell before another British political party will try and paper over conflicts within it by going for referendums.
Thank you. Our last three questions are on the building blocks of effective distributive politics. And the first question is, what factors make it easier or harder to build effective coalitions in politics?
So the answer there is the sorts of things that we talked about. You need a compelling moral narrative. You need well-defined proximate goals. You need leadership. You need resources. And you need to think about ways of preventing what you're trying to do getting undone. The most effective being getting approximate goals embedded in a major party platform for the future. And if you can do those things, your innovations are more likely to be achieved and to endure.
Okay, thank you. A student was wondering whether you can explain how the tension between politics without policy and policy without politics help us make sense of the current state of the Democratic Party presidential primary.
Sure. So if you think about the proposals that are being discussed in the Democratic primaries at the moment, or until this point, they have largely been things that appeal to the base of the Democratic Party, who are the people who turn out in primaries. So what we've had things like lots of talk, particularly in the early debates, about reparations for harms done to African Americans since the beginning of the Republic, and even before. We've had talk about universal health care for all, Medicare for all, that's priced at somewhere between 20 trillion if you believe Elizabeth Warren, or 40 trillion if you believe some independent costing estimates. We've have proposals for writing off student loans, which would also cost trillions. We've had a variety of proposals that are being made because they appeal to the political base of the Democratic Party, whether they're viable policy or not. And so that's the problem with politics without policy. And it's not always extreme politics without policy. We talked about the subprime mortgage crisis, where there was strong political temptations that came from multiple sources, created something of a coalition of strange bedfellows to promise policies that were politically popular, but were disastrous policies, particularly for the people they were trying to help. When we think about politics without policy, some of the examples I gave were Piketty's proposal for a global wealth tax, or his new proposals for a more extensive redistributive European Parliament that would supplant it would actually have trumping power over the existing EU structures. These are things, whatever their merits might be, are politically so innocent that precisely because he's an economist, not a political scientist, he doesn't think about things like who's the coalition, what's the blocking coalition, where are the resources coming from, where's the leadership coming from, and so on.
Okay. Thank you. So our last question for today is whether you can elaborate on descriptive representation and its normative promise, and are there any empirical examples?
So descriptive representation is the idea that people are elected on the basis of some descriptive attribute, such as being a female or being an ethnic or racial minority. And so there are various ways in which people have tried to achieve this. In a PR system, for instance, some countries have just said every third person on the list must be a woman. Or there's something in a single-member district system there was something called the Pune Pact in India in 1934, which basically identified a number of constituencies. I forget the exact number. I think it was about 43 or something like that, in which only members, they were then called untouchables now, I think the more acceptable term is scheduled castes. Only members of scheduled castes could run in those constituencies as candidates. So that's one way in which you can increase descriptive representation. What we have done in the US has largely been achieved in other ways. One is by pressure within political parties, such as the McGovern-Fraser reforms. We talked in one of the lectures about the Rainbow Coalition that Jesse Jackson was pushing. But the most important way in which it's been achieved is the creation of majority-minority districts. And that about a fifth of the congressional districts in Congress now in some form or other majority-minority districts, where there's self-conscious design of districts in order to ensure that there will be a strong likelihood that a member of an ethnic minority will get elected. And indeed, they have been successful. If you look at the staunch advocates of improving descriptive representation, like Desmond King and Roger Smith in their book, Still a House Divided, they point out that there simply were no African American representatives from the South in Congress before. And that is the case. And that's no longer the case. So that is how we have increased descriptive representation. It comes at a cost. One argument that gets made is it may have come at the price of weakening their interest-based representation, because there's a huge empirical debate as to whether and to what extent it has increased the Republican power in the South, which was coming anyway because of the Nixon Southern strategy long before we had majority-minority districts, the backlash against the civil rights laws, and so on. So it was coming anyway, but people argue about whether majority-minority districts increased that Republican takeover of the South. And the evidence is somewhat murky on the point, and it's difficult to nail down. Certainly a lot of activists believe it. The point I make is that whether or not it actually helped to bring it about, it makes it harder to undo. And I think that's incontrovertible. The other thing from the point of view of the argument in my book with Francis Rosenbluth is that it greatly undermines the idea that we really should be looking for districts where the median voter pretty much mirrors the national median voter. So, as we've said, in the ideal case, we'd have kind of flower petal constituencies or districts where you have urban, suburban, and rural voters in every district, as near as you could engineer it. And majority-minority districts push in the exact opposite direction. So in terms of the possibility of creating strong, disciplined parties, it's not a good way to improve descriptive representation. It would be much better to have some version of Pune Pact, which would be difficult in the U.S. because it would run into constitutional objections, I think. But from a point of view of political science, it would be a much better way to improve descriptive representation than what we've in fact done.
Great. That was our last question. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll look forward to reading the exams.
Exactly. Good luck.